It's working.
Thank you, friends. Welcome to the side event, What the F to Do About Fossil Fuels, an event hosted by the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, Stand.Earth, War on Want, and the Center for International Environmental Law. My name is Alex Rafalowicz. I'm the Executive Director of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Hopefully you've heard a lot about this treaty in the last few weeks. It's been a global civil society-led initiative to call for an international agreement to complement the Paris Accord to drive a fair and fast exit from fossil fuels globally. If you pick up the Paris Agreement, you will not be able to find the words fossil fuels in it. You will not be able to find the word coal. You will not be able to find the word oil. You will not be able to find the word gas. And yet these three fuels are the leading source of CO2 in our atmosphere, responsible for 86% of those emissions over the last decade. And so a focus on fossil fuels is absolutely essential if we are to really achieve climate justice. But the fossil fuel system exists in a world that is in itself designed to be inequitable. It is a world that has been designed by colonialism, by patriarchy, by racism, and by a capitalist logic. And so if we are going to unstitch the fossil fuel system, we are going to have to do it with a justice and equity lens. And so the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, as a network of civil society organizations from over 120 countries, every continent in the world, has come together to say, we want to meet the 1.5 degree goal, we want to do it with justice, and that means we are going to need to negotiate a new international agreement that solidifies the norm that there can be no new oil, coal, or gas projects, that there must be an equitable phase out of existing fossil fuel projects, and that we need a new mode of international solidarity and cooperation to ensure that there is a global just transition and transformation across the world. So with me today to discuss this, I'm very pleased to be joined by a panel of experts in international, national, and local policy and activism and advocacy in advancing a just transition away from fossil fuels. We have with me Dean Bhebhe from the PowerShift Africa, Dan Lert, the Deputy Mayor of Paris, who is joining us virtually. We will be joined by Dr. Maria Neira of the World Health Organization. We have Nikki Reisch of the Center for International Environmental Law, Eriel Deranger of Indigenous Climate Action, and Asad Rehman of War on Want. So we're going to get into it. Our panelists have prepared some short interventions, after which we hope to have a discussion with those of you who are here and potentially watching online. So Dean, let's start. We've seen here a concerted effort at this so-called African COP to set Africa on a fossil fuel pathway. Could you tell us about the Don't Gas Africa campaign and why that campaign exists and what it is calling for here?
Thank you, Alex. Evening, everyone. The Don't Gas Africa campaign is a collective of CSOs in Africa who came together to call out African leaders to not adopt gas as a transition fuel at COP27. The Don't Gas Africa campaign, fundamentally at its core, is a people-centered approach where we are reacting to the government's recent dash for gas in Africa. And what our plight fundamentally is that investing in gas investments will fundamentally lock Africa in a future that is grounded on uncertainty and precarity. The Don't Gas Africa campaign fundamentally wants to also say that investing in fossil gas production will lock the continent, creating stranded assets, for example, and already we have seen the climatic shocks as a result of the climate emergency, floods in South Africa, floods in the Niger Delta, famine across sub-Saharan Africa. Already a significant number of people have been left victimized around the historical extractivism of coal, oil. I don't have to mention the people in Lake Turkana who were displaced as a result of energy projects. I don't have to speak about the people in Limpopo in South Africa who had their relatives' graves desecrated, all in the name of creating coal mines. So fundamentally, the Don't Gas Africa campaign wants to end energy appetite, wants to own the energy narrative, and wants to center people at its core using a human rights framework where Africa can finally be a key stakeholder within the emerging green global economy instead of just being a headline or a victim of the climate crisis.
Thank you so much, Dean. And your team and campaign's advocacy in this COP has been so fundamental to making clear what people who live in Africa really want to see and what they don't want to see. And so thank you for your leadership and efforts. We're now going to shift from some reflections on the continent-wide policy making to a more local one. And we're really pleased to be joined by Dan Lert, sorry, I got confused with Dean then. Dan Lert, who is the Deputy Mayor of Paris in charge of the ecological transition, climate plan, water and energy since July 2020. Thank you for joining us online, Dan. Could you tell us a little bit more about the role of cities in driving a just transition from fossil fuels and why Paris was one of 70 cities across the world that has called for a Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty? We can't hear you. We're just gonna do a tech check.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Please go ahead. Thank you so much for joining us.
So I'm really sorry. I'm not Dan Lert. I'm his chief of staff, and he will be here in approximately 20 minutes.
Okay, we'll come back.
So, okay.
Very good.
I cannot tell you.
Thank you very much. Which means, Eriel, I hope you're ready a little bit earlier. And if you were going to buzz off the Parisian reflections, you'll have to change plans. The next person that we're going to hear from is Eriel Deranger, who has been a spokesperson for her nation, the Athabasca Chippewayan First Nation, for over 6 years. She's been following these and other processes for an extremely long time and has a deep experience in how her nations have been resisting fossil fuel expansion and what that means in the country we call Canada. So I'll pass to you, Eriel. I wonder if you could talk to us about some of the reflections you've heard. For example, there was a panel hosted by IEN about the role of the importance of free and prior informed consent and its role in developing a just transition from fossil fuels globally.
Thank you. Excuse me. Iklanete, Dene Sot Leneta, Eriel Seekwe Hushe, Deranger Bitsiani Hasli. My name is Eriel Seekwe Deranger, and I'm a member of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. Also, I was the spokesperson for my nation. I'm now the Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action, which is Canada's only Indigenous-led climate justice organization. I think when we talk about the necessity of having Indigenous rights centered in fossil fuel treaties, and what does that really mean, we have to look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was passed in 2007, which looked to define the collective rights of Indigenous communities and the minimum standards to protect those rights. And one of the fundamental standards that is highlighted within that declaration is free, prior, and informed consent. Free of coercion, manipulation, intimidation, bribery. Prior, meaning long before projects, policies, governance are undertaken. And informed, meaning that the best available information is given to the communities so that they can determine whether or not they want to participate. Instead of free, prior, and informed consent as a bare minimum standard to support the rights of Indigenous communities being seen, particularly within the climate negotiations that not only don't mention oil, gas, and coal, but have minimized what the rights of Indigenous peoples are in the context of building solutions for a climate-stable future. Regardless of the continuation of recognizing Indigenous peoples as stewards of the land, we still don't have decision-making powers within negotiations or even at the state level for determining the policies or the ways in which our economies and our just transition strategies are moving forward. Having an international fossil fuel treaty is absolutely imperative because of the lack of real leadership within the halls of the UNFCCC and the negotiations, where we've seen the increase of corporations, corporate delegations being the largest delegate here, largest delegate in Glasgow, but we've seen them increase by an additional 25% this year. Almost every state pavilion has a oil and gas industry representative of some sort or presentation, and we see them driving the discourse and the dialogue, and they have a vested interest in coming in those big numbers because at the same time, Indigenous peoples have also been growing in our representation here. And we have been advocating for solutions that are not wrapped up in market-based solutions that are looking to create carbon offsets that do nothing to actually reduce emissions, but further allow these industries to continue business as usual, which is violating our rights. My brother explained that we are seeing projects still being driven forward that are desecrating our grave sites, our cultural sites, our sacred sites. And these are not just simply things, it's not just a piece of land, it's not just like, oh, there was a thing that was once there. As Indigenous peoples, we have an intimate relationship with the natural world. My people are the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, and we come from the last remaining freshwater inland delta in the world, also recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in northern Alberta, called the Wood Buffalo National Park. Yet upstream from our projects, we also have the largest industrial oil and gas project, which is the Alberta tar sands. These projects are desecrating our lands and territories through the contamination and the degradation of our ecosystems. But our traditional name was Kaitale Dene Sotlene. Kaitale means people of the willow, people of the land. And as we've seen our lands and territories be diminished by ongoing oil and gas extraction in our territory, my chief once said, "What happens when they destroy the delta? What happens when they've destroyed the entire place that we have known since time immemorial? Who are we? Can we still call ourselves Kaitale Dene Sotlane? So once we advance treaties for a fossil fuel treaty, we also have to include the rights of Indigenous communities and free, prior, and informed consent. The very economies that are desecrating this planet and contributing to rising greenhouse gas emissions, we were not a part of creating those economic centers. We were not a part of creating the policies that govern those industries. And we need to be at the center of governing the solutions for tomorrow. We absolutely must be a part of the solutions for developing a fossil fuel treaty at the municipal level, at the state or provincial level, and at the larger state level, and at the international level. International Indigenous rights movements are growing within the halls of the UNFCCC, within the CBD, and across all UN mechanisms. It's high time we find ways to integrate those and implement them, not just give them flowery language that says Indigenous rights, we respect it, we see your knowledge, but what does it mean to have teeth? What does it mean for us to actually respect those rights? What are the mechanisms that we can activate when our rights are violated? When the graves of our ancestors are desecrated? Where is the recourse? Where is the reparations? And how do we move forward for a climate justice future that doesn't just put corporations at the forefronts and centers, but puts human rights and the rights of peoples? After all, we have been stewards of the world's biodiversity to the point that 80% of what's left of the world's biodiversity exists within our lands and territories. We know what's best for the land because of our intimate relationship, and we absolutely need to be included in driving forward a climate-safe future that does not include fossil fuels. Thank you. Masicho.
Thank you so much, Eriel. And those reflections, I think, are powerful on a number of levels. And I just want to reiterate for those who are here learning about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty that there is no current proposed text for such a treaty. That's something that we hope will begin to be developed as governments take up the call here in Sharm el-Sheikh. And so it's very clear from that intervention, I think, that we can all see that there would need to be in any proposed treaty clear mechanisms that give teeth to the rights that are inherently belong to the Indigenous peoples and First Nations that do so much across our world for their own cultures and to protect their lands and our shared Mother Earth. So thank you for making those points so clearly. And also for highlighting the risks and challenges around the market-based offset approach, which has also seemed to be dominant in the halls here, which has so far failed spectacularly to slow climate change, and at the same time has led to further abuses of human rights and harms to communities. So we appreciate those, and perhaps we'll get into a little bit of discussion on them after our other speakers. Our next speaker, unfortunately, was not able to attend and hasn't actually made it to COP today, but she did record us a video. So we're now going to hear from Dr. Maria Neira, who since 2005 has been the director of the Department of Public Health and the Environment at the World Health Organization. Please enjoy Dr. Neira's presentation. Sound for the video, please. Thank you.
I'm very proud to be a champion on this fossil fuels non-proliferation. The reason is because The drivers of climate change are the drivers of air pollution, which is responsible for 7 million premature deaths every year. This is unacceptable. Those drivers are the most important ones, the combustion of fossil fuels. So for public health, it's fundamental that we stop this addiction to the consumption of fossil fuels, and we need to accelerate the transition to sustainable, renewable, clean sources of energy. The combustion of fossil fuels is literally killing us. Years ago, WHO was very strong on a campaign against tobacco consumption. Some years ago, we said that pollution is the new tobacco. Air pollution is the new tobacco, in the sense that we need to use the same tools that we learned from the tobacco campaign to make sure that one day our people will be able to breathe clean air, and air at least that will not be killing us. We are very happy to join this movement that hopefully will reduce enormously this unacceptable number of deaths that we have every year. We count on champions. We will be as strong as we were with the tobacco, and even more, because the number of interest around the air pollution are probably even bigger than the ones around tobacco. Hopefully, one day we will be able to say that the number of people that is suffering because of exposure to air pollution is zero.
So I think the message about the health risks and impacts of fossil fuels is very important to the message of why we need a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. I think also the reflections about the capacity to come up with new international legal instruments that can address the problems that we're facing is also demonstrated by the success movements and doctors had in developing the tobacco control treaty. Similarly, it was often doctors and medical professionals who led the campaigns against other weapons, be they weapons of mass destruction like nuclear weapons, or inhumane. All weapons are probably inhumane, but particularly inhumane weapons like the landmines. And so the voices of health professionals as a part of our movement, I think, are really important for motivating and moving people and institutions. We're now going to shift to Nikki Reisch, who is the Director of Climate and Energy at the Center for International Environmental Law, where she works at the intersection of human rights and environmental law, overseeing research, analysis, legal and policy advocacy related to climate change, to fossil fuels, and responses to the climate emergency. Nikki, I know that the Center for International Environmental Law has been deeply involved in the Plastics Treaty, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about why those of us who are fighting fossil fuels, hopefully everybody in this room, should also be considering policy mechanisms related to plastics, and also what you have learnt from that experience that might be relevant as we work together to realize a fossil fuel treaty.
Thank you, Alex. Is this working? Thank you, Alex, and thanks to the organizers for having me here. It's really an honor, in particular, to be part of this panel. It's really, thank you, excuse me. I'll try that again. Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty for helping to convene this. It's really an honor to be here today, in particular on what is Phase Out Fossils Day, where we are pushing collectively for the need for an unqualified phase out of all fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, without which we cannot keep 1.5 alive, we cannot keep communities and Mother Earth alive. And to join this panel, making the case based in science, based in economics, based in human rights, including the rights of Indigenous peoples, for accelerating the transition to a fossil-free future through the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty and accompanying advocacy. So as Alex said, I'm going to talk a little bit about plastics. And of course, you may be wondering, what do plastics have to do with fossil fuel phase out and a fossil fuel treaty? Next slide, please. So plastics are fossil fuels in another form. 99% of plastics are made from fossil fuels, predominantly oil and gas. Petrochemicals derived from oil and gas are the building blocks of plastics. They're used to make the resins that become the plastic products that are accumulating not just on our shelves, but in landfills, in oceans, in the farthest reaches of the planet, from the Mariana Trench to Mount Everest, and in the deepest reaches of our own bodies. Plastics are also driving climate change. Plastics pollute, next slide please, throughout their life cycles, from extraction and processing to use and waste management. And CIEL has been detailing this intersection, trying to expose the fact that plastics are part and parcel of this fossil fuel crisis and this climate crisis that it's created, and have impacts on climate, environment, and health throughout their life cycles. You know, the increase in plastic production and consumption is threatening our rapidly dwindling ability to limit global temperature rise to 1.5. The current plans on the table to increase plastic production just by 2030 could increase greenhouse gas emissions so much that it could consume roughly 13% of their entire remaining carbon budget. Just think about that. Production of plastics, and chiefly a significant portion, 40% of that production for single-use plastic, is driving the pollution that is choking this planet and communities. So plastics are not just about a toxic pollution and health problem, they're a climate problem and very much an oil and gas problem. And as other speakers have reiterated here, we cannot fight climate change without getting off of fossil fuels. We cannot get off of fossil fuels without reducing or eliminating major sources of industrial demand for oil and gas. And I just want to give you a glimpse of how significant that demand is. The fossil fuel industry, which has been disproportionately represented here, as we've heard at this COP, and is having its views represented in the negotiating halls as well, is betting on the growth of plastics and petrochemicals to prop up demand for their dirty products and sustain their business model. Let me just explain what that means. Increasing production and use of plastics is boosting demand for the petrochemicals made from oil and gas that are the building blocks. And so those petrochemicals, according to the International Energy Agency, are the single biggest driver of growth in demand for oil and gas. Let me just repeat that. Petrochemicals, the building blocks of plastics and other destructive toxic products, are the single biggest driver of growth and demand for oil and gas. And so it's no wonder that the fossil fuel industry is pushing plastics and petrochemical-based products and solutions and false solutions that are driving that crisis and contributing to the climate crisis. As the demand for oil and gas as fuel sources declines, more stringent regulations are put in place and renewables are increasingly competitive, the demand for oil and gas as fuel sources is dropping, so oil and gas companies are looking for petrochemicals to make up the difference. Next slide, please. And we can see here, Patrick Pouyanné, as some of you may know, the famous or infamous head of Total, put it quite simply, thanks to plastics, the oil and gas industry still has bright days ahead of it, to translate roughly his quote there. So this is not an imagined connection. This is a connection that is at the heart of the strategy of the industry that is representing itself here at this forum to derail efforts to phase out fossil fuels and to get us on the necessary path to a climate-safe future. Next slide. Just a couple more points here. Petrochemicals and plastics are playing a really significant role in driving the current dash for gas, particularly the colonialist attempts to turn Africa into a gas station to feed the fossil fuel addiction of the global north. We've heard a lot about that at this COP because if you read some accounts across this forum, you would think that gas is actually the pathway to the future, when in fact it's a pathway to the past. It's a pathway to nowhere, and will lock us into where we are today in a destructive, climate-destroying, humanity-destroying path. The fossil fuel crisis that was precipitated by the war in Ukraine should have been a wake-up call and really an impetus to curb all unnecessary uses of fossil fuels, such as the production of single-use plastics. Instead, what we've seen is a rush to secure new sources. A new report that CIEL and the Break Free from Plastic movement put out just last month showed that in the European Union, for example, plastics production is by far the largest user of oil, gas, and electricity, the largest industrial user of oil, gas, and electricity, overshadowing other energy-intensive industries such as steel and automobile manufacturing. It was responsible for, fully a fifth, of industrial gas and 2/5 of oil consumption in the EU. So the message there is that one of the most important steps that can be taken to reduce reliance on gas and curtail the rush for extractive colonialism in Africa and across the world is to curb plastics production. It is a critical and should be a ready solution adopted by governments in the EU and across the world. Next and final slide, please. So the fight against plastic pollution is not just linked to the fight against fossil fuels. It also holds some really important lessons for that fight and the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign. And I want to leave on this note because I think it's a hopeful one that gives us some inspiration for how and both the imperative and the possibility to move forward with a legal binding instrument to coordinate a managed decline, a managed retreat from a fossil-dependent economy. Through the United Nations Environment Assembly, the global movement to address plastic pollution convinced countries to adopt a mandate in March of this year to negotiate a binding international treaty addressing the full life cycle of plastics, from production to design to waste prevention and management. And that process, which is ongoing now and will follow on the heels of this COP, the first negotiating session, is to be concluded in 2 years. And I think that process not only reflects the power of social movements, because there was a worldwide social movement demanding action on plastics pollution and calling for attention to the full life cycle, knowing that we cannot fight plastics pollution without fighting plastics production and turning off that tap, much in the same way we cannot fight climate change without turning off the fossil fuel tap. That process is a critical one to send a message that it's possible for countries to come together and manage the decline of a sector or product that seems ubiquitous and built into every aspect of our life, but that requires a coordinated and legally binding effort to phase out our dependence on destructive products and consumerist models. And finally, like plastics, fossil fuels are deeply intertwined with our society and economies, and addressing their contribution to the triple planetary crisis, that is the climate crisis, the toxic pollution crisis, and the biodiversity crisis, requires a coordinated effort. And we've seen this week with the new endorsements of the Fossil Fuel Treaty that the momentum is building. It's growing and it cannot be stopped. Whatever the negotiators in these halls decide, whether they have the courage to call out and recognize the need in science to phase out all fossil fuels in an unqualified manner without exception or loophole, the future is not fossil. And phase out fossil fuels is an inevitable outcome of where this world needs to move. Parties here need to agree to that unqualified phase out, but we in the movement and around the world will demand that action and will continue to push through initiatives like the treaty and others to make that a reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and thank you for ending on an optimistic note, because I was quite worried for a little bit there. I definitely think we should all be quite worried about the intersection of the plastics industry, of the petrochemical industry, and of the biggest producers of fossil fuels on the planet. But thank you to you and your comrades who have worked so hard to advance a plastics treaty and to show us all in another forum and another example of how citizens working together have been able to drive forward international agreements on pressing problems. We are now going to go to the Deputy Mayor of Paris, Dan. Hopefully you can join us on this Zoomy Skype. Wonderful. Hi, Dan. It's great for you to join us. I'll pass to you now.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for this invitation, and sorry for being late, and sorry not to be with you at COP27 in person today. Tonight, I'm going to talk about 3 topics. First, what role cities can play in accelerating the global transition. Then I'm going to explain why Paris has joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And finally, I have a quick word about the lawsuit we joined against Total Energy. On the one hand, Paris hosted COP21 in 2015 and witnessed the signing by all the states of the first universal agreement on climate change. We carry a responsibility. I believe we carry the responsibility to lead by example the implementation of the main principles of the Paris Agreement in our city. By implementing 500 actions today, the climate plan lays out the path towards carbon neutrality by 2050, with a territory powered 100% by renewable energies. As Paris Deputy Mayor in charge of climate change, my role is to assist the implementation of this plan while ensuring a just, resilient, and inclusive transition. On the other hand, Paris has already warmed up by more than 2 degrees Celsius. We have published last year an extended climate change impact assessment. This study underlines several major risks for our territory, including the growing frequency of heat waves, of heavy rains. Last summer perfectly illustrate what to expect. We experienced 6 heat waves, heavy rainfall on the 15th of August, a drought alert running during several weeks. Summer 2022 is only a first stage of what is ahead. We know now that a 50 degrees heat peak is possible, and our responsibility is to anticipate this eventuality and protect inhabitants, especially the most fragile. Cities and communities pay an exorbitant cost for climate change effects. It is costly to reduce greenhouse gas emission. It is costly to adapt the city to climate change consequences. As an example, we estimate that a 10-year flood costs between 3 and 30 billion euros. The probability of its occurrence is increased by 30% due to climate change. All our efforts to tackle climate change and adapt to its consequences are vain if we don't reduce drastically the production and consumption of fossil fuels. Despite the International Energy Agency prescribed in its Net Zero by 2050 report the immediate end to investments in fossil fuels in order to meet Paris Agreement objectives, G20 countries have invested 3 times more on fossil fuels than on renewable energy sources. This is the reason why last year Paris has officially joined the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty to call on the international community to set a new treaty on this issue. We are trying to convince other cities to join us and advocate it on European and international platforms. Last but not least, the city of Paris, together with New York City, has joined a lawsuit against the French petrol major Total Energy. This case aims to have the court order Total to take the necessary measures to drastically reduce its greenhouse gas emissions and align itself with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, in alignment with the French law on the duty of care of parent companies. The lawsuit is similar to the Shell decision in the Netherlands. We know many effort cities make around the world are vain if at the international level, big players like fossil fuels companies and developed countries do not do their part. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dan. I hope you could hear the applause here for the leadership that Paris has displayed. And it is one of many cities across the world. Just last week, Belém in Brazil joined the list of cities and subnational governments to endorse the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. We're going to hear from our last speaker who is here, and then open the floor for some of the questions. Our last speaker is Asad Rehman, who is the executive director of War and Want, where he organizes to put an end to poverty and injustice. So I'm sure we heard about the three intersecting crises of pollution, of biodiversity or extinction, and of fossil fuels and the climate. And I'm sure that Asad will talk about the inequality crisis. Asad, we've also heard about the perils of fossil fuels, and that has been a big focus of our effort as a campaign, and many speaking tonight. But there's also been opposition to the expansion of this industry, not only for climate imperatives, but as well as health imperatives, human rights, Indigenous rights. Yet, so far tonight, we have not spoken about the energy system that we're transitioning to. Could you talk to us about some of the challenges that are presented by current models and plans for the new energy system, and how we might overcome them?
Thank you, Alex. Can you hear me? Nope. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Yeah? I think people can hear me. My voice is starting to go. Too much shouting. Nope. Can you hear? Oh God, you have to go really close. It's like a very weird thing here. So thanks, Alex, and let me begin by saying a few words first about War on Want and how we approach this issue. We work in partnership with frontline communities and social movements across the Global South on extractivism, food sovereignty, workers' rights, and together we build power and tackle the root causes and drivers of climate injustice alongside economic, social, and political injustice. And our work also in the Global North aims to fix the rigged global economic system that has been constructed to extract resources and exploit the Global South with a focus on trade, tax, and corporate power. I'm just reminded that some of us in this room will remember when we as climate justice movements, our exasperation at mainstream environmental groups and those empty calls for action, usually accompanied by pictures of polar bears and people of the Global South up to their necks in water, usually without any agency or without any attempt to give their voice to their perspectives and demands. And I'm always reminded of that, because I think if they had not, maybe we won't be facing the ticking clock of 1.5, the devastating climate impacts that are already engulfing people, and that we know that amplifies all of the other injustices and inequities that are baked into our current economic system. But at the core of that, of course, is we know that they've been constructed with this notion of sacrifice at its core. And that sacrifice is not just about individual geographic places, but of black, brown, indigenous peoples. And it's this notion of sacrifice that inspired the environmental justice movements of black and brown people in the Global North to come together with social movements of the Global South to found the climate justice movement, because these days, of course, everybody claims to be climate justice, and the word seems to be stripped of all of its meaning. And when we look back to those principles that were written back in 2002 of ecological debt, of a just and equitable end to fossil fuels, of people's owned energy systems that address energy poverty, amongst others, we can begin to see how our movements then began to try and weave together these issues and the notion of interconnected crisis, and challenge the idea of lenses that saw each as an issue and a silo in itself, or change as somehow linear. Today we deal with climate, tomorrow we'll deal with justice. And that's nowhere better illustrated than in the approach of some in the Global South, whose answer to the critical issue of how do we end fossil fuels is simply to say, don't worry, we can carry on business as usual with 100% renewable energy. So we have worked with our movements together on a People's Global Green New Deal that challenges this idea by recognizing four key pillars that are needed for this transformation. First of all, we all know we need to limit temperatures to well below 1.5, and that has to be, of course, through equity and fair shares and equitable phase out of fossil fuels, but also an end to, of course, the industrial food system through food sovereignty and agroecology. And increasingly, I think people recognize that none of this is possible without a social compact on poverty. Addressing inequality and poverty is necessary. And we have to still remember that, of course, We're talking about half the world still surviving on the equivalent of less than $5.50, denied public services, billions without access to housing, water, food, etc. But thirdly is the importance of planetary limits. And this is an issue that has largely been ignored by many whose transitions are based solely on the nation state and solely in the global north. We all know we're currently breaching 5 of the 9 planetary boundaries, and the cornerstone of the biosphere in which all of our ecosystems and ultimately all of humanity needs to thrive and survive. And fourthly, we know that none of this is possible without addressing the systems, both historical and current, that maintain this world that has been riven with injustice and inequity. And that's not just currently tax, trade and debt, but it's also the racialized capitalism with its roots in colonialism. So I say that, sorry, before I start on what I want to talk about, that it's undeniable that we have to have an equitable end to fossil fuels and start a momentous shift towards renewable energy. But we have to ask ourselves, will this resource-intensive approach simply attempt to keep our fossil fuel economy going, but just now powered by renewable energy? Will it question the energy intensity of our current economy, or address the unequal way in which energy is distributed, where 3.5 billion people don't have access to electricity or clean cooking, and where many more have only enough electricity or for a light bulb or to charge a mobile phone? Will it take into consideration what that means for communities in the global south who will be turned into sacrifice zones under this approach? As War on Want, we do a report, A Justice Transition is a Post-Extractive Transition, where we highlight that the push to produce the electric vehicle batteries, the solar panels, the energy storage systems, and the wind turbine components is going to kick off an unprecedented level of extraction from various metals and minerals. It's an increase in extraction of some between 30 and 800-fold. A recent World Bank study suggests that current pathways to stay even below the 2 degrees, which we know is a disastrous threshold, will require the extraction of over 3 billion tons of key transition minerals before 20. But that's just one part of the story. The OECD's Global Resources Outlook to 2060 modeled an annual 2.8% annual growth in GDP, and this is critical, estimates that extracted resources would increase from 79 to 167 billion tons. This is a 111% increase overall. And this is at a time when we know that a sustainable level of resource use is around 50 billion tons. So the drive for renewable energy is one part of the wave of coming extraction, where everything about our high-intensity, wasteful and growth-oriented economy demands that we will drive up resource use, where currently resource use and resource extraction itself is responsible for about 50% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So organizations, communities and movements on the front lines of mining struggles, who we've worked with for decades, have warned, look, the switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy without a planned, fair and equitable transition will unleash a wave of green extraction that I've described as well, and generate a new wave, race to the bottom, fraught with conflict and ecosystem destruction. So we have a choice. We can continue as business as usual, or we can take something, an alternative path. In one, we keep the scale and veracity of the fossil fuel economy alive, just now powered by renewables, and let devastation and insufficiency continue to be the norm. Or on the other hand, we mainstream the brutal costs of this business as usual. Amongst our movements, environmentalists, political leaders and the public, we raise alarm at the social and ecological cost of an unjust transition. We build and support awareness for the alternative, which is a carefully planned process of decarbonising, decolonising, democratizing and decommodifying our energy systems. It's a process where you abandon the logic of sacrifice to be in active solidarity with those at the heart of the transition. A transition away from unchecked and unplanned growth for growth's sake, of never-ending material consumption, to one where we carefully say what is indispensable extraction, from where we reduce energy and material needs, addressing the high unequal way energy is currently distributed, to ensure everyone has the energy needed for a decent living. And And we know that we can do that. We can produce enough energy equitably, fairly, for 8 billion people to live a dignified life. But we know we need to do this in a moment where we need to reduce by energy demand by about 60%. If we want to maintain energy consumption in line with a 1.5 degree target. So we have to create a movement that understands EVs, they're part of the solution, but they can't be the core demand. We have to build an economy of redistribution and sufficiency. So that's why we use the Global Green New Deal to fight for public policies that guarantee energy as a public good, that reduce the number and sizes of vehicles on the road to replace them with public, free transit systems that make people want to get out of the cars, where we treat mining as a violent, dangerous practice that should fuel only essential goods, where mining is required, as we've heard, it should be done with the consent and benefit of the communities engaged in, and of binding legislation that guarantees rights and protections, and where we pour our technological innovation into mineral recycling, into circular production to reduce extraction and generate the abundant green jobs that we know are needed. That's why we support the Fossil Fuel Treaty as part of a justice transition, of a post-extractive future, of a people's global Green New Deal that guarantees the right of everyone to live with dignity and in harmony with the planet. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Asad, for laying out some of those challenges that are presented by the energy transition, but also many of the solutions and the way that we can also shift to change our ways of working and the values that we put at the heart of our movement. That's the end of our interventions from panelists this evening. You may have come also to see Brianna Fruin. Unfortunately, she was unwell and couldn't join us, a Pacific climate warrior who has been campaigning and an advocate for the Fossil Fuel Treaty from a Pacific perspective for over a year. But she sends her apologies. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes. We will take 2 or 3 if there's anyone else, if you want to put your hand up. Go.
I'm Delphine Mison, Université Saint-Louis, Brussels. I'd like to know if you already think about fusing the projects like a non-proliferation treaty on plastic and fossil fuel, because actually it's a bit the same issue.
Are there any other questions to kick us off? Or we can go.
Or comments.
Oh, yeah, we've got 2 more. We'll take them and then come back.
Yeah, hi, Sasha Gabizon, Women Engaged for a Common Future. We're a member of Break Free from Plastics, and we love the work of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I was just wondering, have you seen a lot of lobby and advocacy for full solutions from the plastic industry, who pretend that plastic can be green by saying that they can do pyrolysis, they can turn it into energy or whatever. So I was just wondering, because we have such a strong group of lobbyists at this COP, which I've never had before. So that would be interesting to know, and if we can maybe denounce that. And the other thing is, we also work with anti-nuclear activities. You're of course inspired also by the Non-Proliferation Treaty from the nuclear side, but also here, we are very, very worried by the immense push which is given to nuclear for blue hydrogen and stuff like that. It's all full solutions. And yeah, we have to denounce this. We used to write letters every year to all the heads of state and say, we cannot have these huge pavilions by all these full solutions. What are they doing here? But they're paying lots of money, and the host country loves them because they're getting so much money from these pavilions. So yeah, that's just a question if we should bring our forces together on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, we welcome comments as well that might spark further reflections from our panelists. So we'll take one more intervention from the audience and then gather some reflections from the panel.
Thank you. I'm Alexandra Dupré. I'm a research fellow at IDRI, a think tank based in Paris. And I unfortunately arrived only halfway through. I'm interested, I guess my interest is perhaps if you could touch again upon what you mentioned regarding the biodiversity crisis, because from my perspective, working on these two crises, and looking at the IPCC pathways to get to 1.5 that are compatible with both of them, are the only ones that are compatible or viable if we want to address these two challenges are the ones that phase out fossil fuels as much as possible. Otherwise, we're locking ourselves into large-scale carbon dioxide removal, which has a huge land footprint. So I guess it's more a comment than a question, but I would be really interested in, seeing how these two movements of like phasing out fossil fuels and not relying on carbon dioxide removal could come together. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Nikki, I might ask you to kick us off on some of the plastic reflections. And
sure, and thank you for the questions. Thank you for the questions and comments. I think there, as I elaborated on and as is clear, there are deep connections between the plastics industry and the fossil fuel industry, and many of the petrochemical and plastics producers are often, in fact, part of the same companies that are fossil fuel upstream extractors as well. But I think there's a real critical value in keeping processes to develop legal instruments separate and complementary. We've seen the risk of loading up a process with too much and tangling it up in consensus-based dialogues. And I think we are in a position now with the plastics treaty process that's underway and moving at a rapid timescale to ensure that it is the most robust and complete instrument addressing the full life cycle of plastics, which would have significant implications for fossil fuel production for petrochemicals and plastics. So if we can curb the demand for and the production of plastics and petrochemicals, that will necessarily have an effect on fossil fuel extraction, and that's critical. So there's a complementary role there, but we have an opportunity with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty to pursue pathways that can move quickly and with the ambition that is urgently needed, because every day that passes, the world is hurtling towards crisis and catastrophic levels of warming. And so there's an opportunity to seize creative first mover groups to kick off a process, to negotiate an instrument, and to really put their heads together on critical principles. But I see those as complementary. I did want to address the issue of false solutions. And I think that has been a predominant theme at this COP as well. The oil and gas industry's strategy is to portray its products not as the problem that they are for the planet and the people on the lines of their extraction and combustion, but rather as part of the solution. So you might have walked around these halls and heard stories told about gas being the way we are going to get, the future, that the pathway to renewable energy runs right through an oil field or a gas field. Nothing could be further from the truth. And try as they might, no techno fixes and unproven or speculative technologies that have been shown time and again not to work, like carbon capture and storage, can make gas clean or oil green or coal climate safe. They are ways to cover up the impacts of those fuel sources, of those dirty energy sources, and to sustain business as usual extraction. And we need to call that out, and we need to reject any attempts to water down what the science requires, what human rights and what Mother Earth require, which is an unqualified phase out of all fossil fuels. These techno fixes only delay action. And this gets us to the biodiversity question, and I will end here because it is all interrelated, that delaying needed reductions of emissions today will only jeopardize our chances of saving people and ecosystems and this planet. What we need to focus on is the known proven solutions today, like energy demand reduction and reducing our consumptivist model and renewable energy. And phasing out fossil fuels immediately is necessary for that. pathways that depend on carbon dioxide removal or experimental and speculative technologies at large-scale geoengineering or direct air capture, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, these techno-fixes that are being touted and trumpeted in these halls and pavilions where many industries are have their wares on display in what has become much more of an expo or trade show than it has been a space for making law to save people and planet. Those technologies can gain back the atmospheric space that we don't have anymore. They cannot recover the damage that is done. They are not the urgently needed measures to change our practices and to save the prospects of living together on this planet in the future. And we need to reject that delay tactic and distraction and focus on what we know works, what is here and now, and generate the political will to put that in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Eriel, you want to jump in? Yeah.
On the biodiversity crisis, I think that I think it was just today, a group of government and civil society leaders have called for the CBD COP15 in Montreal to be the Paris Agreement for biodiversity, and are making the linkages between the negotiations happening here and what needs to be happening within the biodiversity movement. And those deep interconnections of the solutions, i.e. false solutions that are being proposed in these UNFCCC spaces, and how they serve to undermine the movement of the conservation on biological diversity COPs. And so we need to be moving towards how we create, so there is now sort of a push to have references to the CBD, or the Convention on Biological Diversity, in the COP27 covered decision text to emphasize the importance of biodiversity in climate action. And it's directly correlated personally for myself to the movement for human rights and Indigenous people's rights. And we can't be allowing false solutions, particularly the co-optation of things like nature-based solutions that actually only serve to continue to propagate oil and gas projects and do nothing to actually reduce or phase out or end the expansion of fossil fuels. I see this personally in my own traditional territory, in Treaty 8 territory in Northern Alberta, where the very industries from the oil and gas sector have been here presenting green technologies and are looking to cash in on climate finance and to cash in on these new markets like carbon sequestration and carbon trading mechanisms that actually won't result in them in stopping their expansion. Right now in my territory, there have been more new approvals for tar sands expansion projects than there ever has been right now, because the industry is rushing to lock in approvals for their project up to 2030, because that's when they plan to start to wind down. That doesn't mean stop. So they're approving, locking in projects, and they're doing it under the guise that they're going to do carbon offsets. And again, that does nothing to save the critical biodiversity, and it exacerbates the threats to the biodiversity that is left through ongoing climate crisis. In my regions, we have seen out-of-control forest fires in a delta, which is supposed to be marshlands, and then we have seen massive flooding, all within a scope of 2 years. We are seeing absolute decreases in the health and longevity of our ecosystems because of both direct contamination and destruction from these industries and ongoing climate crisis. And these industries want to continue business as usual. If we do not link the biodiversity crisis to the climate crisis, we are going to lose on both sides.
Thank you, Eriel. I think Asad wants to jump in as well.
Thank you. I mean, our starting point has always been, right, no temperature level is safe, it is deadly, right, for many. And it's always interesting, you know, when you look at what the IPCC said, you know, about the world, we know now is going to be dramatically different within 10, 20 years, and the window is rapidly closing for a sustainable world, right? And then you see these corporate lobbyists here, and you know, those pavilions, $1 million pavilions, and absolutely, it's become a huge corporate fair. And what I find fascinating and of course very dangerous for all of us is absolutely that they're here peddling that they are the solution. And it's the same with the fossil fuel industry, it's the same with the mining industry. You know, before COVID, we were at BHP Billiton at AGM, and it was fascinating. You had communities from all across the world talking about the destructive practices of BHP Billiton and what it had done to poison their land, their water, the air, what it was doing in terms of their ecosystems. And the response from BHP Billiton was, well, we are the solution to the climate crisis. We are the answer. So, and we see this here, right? And I think what we're seeing now is these industries have realized it's no longer possible to be climate denialists. And what they are doing is both denying that there is need for mitigation, but of course positioning themselves in terms of the false solution and how they are weaving together many of these false solutions. In the industry, they're one of the largest proponents of green hydrogen. And if you look at what they're saying in Chile and in other places, they're saying that's how we will, don't worry, we're not going to use fossil fuels to extract the minerals and metals. We're going to use green hydrogen. So this will be green mining. You know, this will be the new wave of what we're doing, exactly as they're saying with deep sea mining. Look, 30 years of CCS, and they've not been able to, well, 50 years of CCS, and they've not been able to bring it to scale. And the CCS that they have had on tap, you know, over 70% of it has been used to extract more fossil fuels. So I think our job is not simply to fight for what we want. I think it's to also recognize to fight against what they are proposing. And this is a battle of ideas. This is a battle of solutions, a battle of visions. And the enemy isn't now out there. The enemy is inside this COP. And so our fight has to be also about raising the reality of what the false solutions that are being peddled.
Thank you. Oh, so yes, we've got 1, 2, 3. So we'll do those 3 and then get some reflections on those and close.
Alberto Parise, Vivat International. I agree that we need to reduce the demand for energy. And if I got you right, you said by 60%. My question is, what structural transformations are needed to achieve that goal?
Thank you so much for a very amazing presentation. I'm Goile Munang, I'm with PowerShift Africa, and I just wanted to sort of get your thoughts on this battle of ideas, this battle of narratives, where the fossil fuel industry is also using emancipatory language like just transition, you know, colonialism, you know, all of those words, particularly with you know, with an intention to galvanize communities to lean into fossil fuels due to the failure or perception of the failure of multilateralism. So I'd like to know what your comments are on that. And then on the other side of the coin, you know, as we implement renewable energy, you know, I'd like to know your thoughts and your comments around how we do not repeat the same exclusionary practices of fossil fuels. And perhaps in this context of treaties, you know, I'll even just use my own country as an example. We have the Lesotho Islands Water Project, which is, you know, really amazing. Hydro gives Lesotho electricity to a certain degree, excludes communities, but then South Africa water. So it's hailed as one of the best, you know, bilateral agreements. So within the bilateral space, within this treaty space where deals are locked in for 40 years and there's no, you know, places where we can monitor, evaluate, and criticize until the deal is done, you know. So I'd like to just get a few comments on that. Thanks.
Hi, Asad. This is Aruna from Carbon Brief. This is an amazing presentation, and thank you for always speaking, well, power to power. My question also is, I think he just framed it, but the idea that fossil fuel companies are using the language of climate justice, they're explicitly, isn't it bizarre to hear Adani use terms like climate justice to, on one hand, justify more fossil fuel exploration or more mines? And I think it's important, it would be great to have your reflection, especially since you were talking about how the word climate justice is being hollowed out. And also, I mean, concerns around what is just, I mean, now you've got jet peas and how that's sort of playing out. We've had some people say that this is being done well, but have we seen good examples of just transitions happening in various parts of the world? And is the UNFCCC process or our initiatives that are set under this, are they reaching local communities and how that is being done? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. So a couple of clear questions there. And Dean, I might invite you to offer some first reflections, particularly about the use of language by fossil fuel advocates.
Yeah, sure, thank you. Yeah, of course, indeed, we now live in an age where they've not only stolen, you know, our land and our livelihoods, but they've also stolen our identity. And that's why it's important here at COP to come together instead of working in silos to create that one strong narrative and start really debunking those false solutions that have been embedded under the umbrella of truth. I mean, it's clear, economics and science, you know, fossil fuels are not clean, fossil fuels are not green, and we really need to start coming out and really speaking together with one voice. When they call us anti-development, we say no, we are for Africa's development, but we want to be discussing about how that development can be understood using sustainable and eco-friendly means. When they come out and tell us that we are pro-colonialism, we actually say energy colonialism in Africa or in the global south is actually us being again embedded in a cycle that will only recycle us in poverty and inequality. As a result, we are actually against anti-colonialism, and actually the dash for gas is an issue around colonialism because, once again, Africa and the global south decision is not based on the behalf of Africa and its people or the global south, but in the hands of the few. When they do come out and say we are not pro-employment or pro-people, there's already evidence that currently exists that can equip us as activists to really challenge that and move forward as a collective. We need to use this opportunity to a large extent to even end energy appetite. By that, I mean we need to end the fossil fuel-induced energy. Appetite in Africa has left over 600 million people without electricity, and access to clean renewable energy is one of the answers. And we need to scale up cost-effective, clean, decentralized renewable energy, which is the fastest and best way to end energy poverty in Africa. And then you have people who will tell you that, well, fossil fuels are way, 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 way more cheaper than renewable energy. And that is clearly false, right? And we need to start engaging that type of material. Africa is already at 28% as a collective, as a continent, when it comes to scaling up renewable energy. Why end now? You have individuals who will tell you that sometimes the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow, yet we have got companies, small, medium enterprises in the UK, in the United States, who have made a significant amount of profit from storage solutions. So why is Africa failing and stopping now? You have individuals that will tell you that, well, we do not have the finance when it comes to establishing renewable energy. Africa can sustain its systems by itself. But then we have been victims of a social fabric that's been embedded by what we would like to call colonialism to make us believe that we cannot be self-sustained as a country. You cannot tell me we cannot afford to harness the sun, yet we've already developed 100 years vast of technology that has actually prepared us for those instances. So fundamentally, we need to own that narrative and come out with the common voice in order to tackle these false narratives. At the end of the day, they're simple and clear. There's just a reason and many reasons as to why the fossil fuel industry will continue to exploit the global south. It's just one of the many reasons as to why they would use those examples for fossil fuels to be glorified in Africa. But fundamentally, what it really means for us fossil fuels is nothing but suffering, famine, drought, and global warming. And the minute we start owning that narrative, the minute we start speaking out based on lived experiences supported by evidence-based research, including the financials, we will come out winning. We have already won. I mean, Team Energy Africa formed last week to come into COP to create, their gas communique. 3 days into COP, SE4O, UNECA, all pulled out of Team Energy Africa. So there are solid wins. We just need to own that narrative and believe that we are, again, masters of our own destiny.
Thank you, Dean. I might run down the panel to mix this with closing reflections. Eriel.
I'll leave my comments short, but I think it's really important to understand that there is a battle of narratives here. And I think when we first started having, climate negotiations, we had a lot of the oil and gas corporations really embedding themselves as climate deniers. And it reminds me of the quote from Gandhi. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, and then they fight you, and then you win. Right now, they are fighting us. They are ramping up their participation and their campaigns and their propaganda because they want to continue to control both economies and energy sources. When we talk about reducing our demand, how do we get there? We can't be talking about outsourcing and creating sacrifice zones to continue to power big cities while leaving urban or an indigenous community, or not urban, rural and indigenous communities in energy deficits. Our lands and territories cannot be exploited to power colonial urban settler centers. They need to be looking at a democratized system that centers the land, our relationship with the lands, and our relationships with each other. Despite all of this, when they show up like that, it is actually an indication that we have been winning. We were advancing and managed to get human rights and indigenous rights recognized within the preambular text of the Paris Agreement. And that did not come easy. It came from the continuation of the frontline communities fighting for the recognition of those rights. And so we need to continue to advance our movements forward and demand a decentralized, democratized energy system that doesn't put our lands and territories and biodiversity, human and indigenous rights at risk. Thank you.
Thanks. I think the degree of co-optation that we're seeing in these halls and out in the battlefield of the narrative and the real battle that is being played out over what qualifies as a solution shows us just the lengths that corporate greed will go to sustain its sources of profit. And when we are sitting here and watching a COP, sponsored by companies like Coca-Cola, halls, run over with fossil fuel lobbyists, trumpet the words just transition without recognizing that the first step in any transition is acknowledging what you're moving away from. So we hear lots of talk about transition, but no desire to recognize that a transition implies moving from something to something else. So we are leaving behind the fossil economy. We are leaving behind the extractivist model that got us into this problem deep in the hole that we're in. And it is high time to stop digging. And it is high time to recognize that as a critical starting point. But of course, that's not enough. We can't just substitute one extractivist, overconsumptivist model with another. And that critical question about what the structural changes are that are needed to reduce demand for energy while at the same time addressing the urgent need to provide energy to the millions of people who still don't have it and who have a right to energy that sustains their lives and livelihoods and ecosystems. And that's why I think it is critical to start first and foremost with eliminating manufactured demand, demand that is actually generated and drummed up by the companies seeking to sell their dirty products to us, from the oil and gas burned as fuel or used in plastics. And that's why targeting those industrial sources of demand for a disposable lifestyle that there is no room for on this planet anywhere, in any part of the world. We have to get rid of single-use plastics because we shouldn't have single-use anything. We need to have reusable products. We need to have a system that is truly circular. And that is another word that we see being co-opted by corporations. What is a circular economy, a life cycle impacts? We know that has emerged from communities, from the human rights movement, from the climate justice movement, has deep roots in the global south, deep roots in black, brown, marginalized communities, indigenous peoples who have known what it really means to live sustainably and in harmony with environments. And we must reclaim that space and reject the co-optation of these concepts that are core to moving beyond the unjust and unequal world in which we live today, and that has allowed this kind of corporate capture of policymaking. We are not seeing carbon capture work for the planet, we're seeing it work for the corporations that have a stranglehold on the policymaking here and at home in our countries. So I really appreciate the solidarity around the call to calling out the BS that is in these halls and that is plastered on advertisements around the world, the notion that there is such a thing as abated fossil fuels. We should reject that notion because it is the myth on which the fossil economy is trying to build its next business model and future, and to sustain production that cannot be sustained in our planet and in our communities. With that, I will turn it to final words from Asad.
Thank you. Some really great questions there, which we could have spent hours discussing. Absolutely. Look, I absolutely agree. Words have power, right? They're critical words. And we see that with climate justice, with energy poverty, and the just transition. All words stripped of meaning, co-opted. But visions also have power, right? And visions are about necessary if we want to build our power. And I think for too long our movement has been unable to describe the world we want to create, right? Because it's afraid to say that actually capitalism, neoliberalism, racialized capitalism has to go. And we have to have something different. We feel that if we say that, we won't be taken seriously. But we know that that climate justice had a structural analysis of the economy, right? It said that this had to be replaced. Now, the reality as we know it, is at this moment, I don't think our visions should be about less. They should be about better. And that's why we talk about what is it that we need for people to be able to live with dignity? What is it that makes us happy and content? What is it that binds our community? So there are absolutely productive energy. And then we have to build the care economy, the economy that actually sustains us, which will look very, very different from this fossil fuel-based economy, which is based on extractives and commodities. Now, as Warren, we've got a report on neocolonialism of Africa, right, where you can do a map of the African continent, and you look at the colonial powers, and then you do a map of the commodities, and it's exactly the same map with commodities going from the global system, from Africa, power and resource the global north. And we know, Walter Rodney famously wrote about how Europe underdeveloped Africa. I mean, the reality is that the global south is developing the global north. We have to talk about that each and every year, net 2 trillion flows from the global south to the global north. We have to make part of our demands redistribution and reparations. That climate is only one part. Yes, we're talking about the trillions that are needed for the justice transition, but actually we need a return of the wealth so that actually people have an alternative and can build that. That's why simply saying end fossil fuels or build renewable energy without saying how, where are the money's going to come from, where are we going to have the climate waivers. Now we know leaders of our movements have been saying this, Lumumba in Congo, Mossadegh in Iran. They talked about how our commodities need to be owned by our people to service for our own people in the global south. And of course, they were assassinated and murdered and dictators put in their place. But this is our time, I think, for our movement to reimagine what anti-imperialism looks like. And people think that, oh God, that's a radical word, but it's actually an incredibly important word, because without it, I think we are going to face a challenge, right? We saw it in France, where the Gilets jaunes said, the elites worry about the end of the world, we ordinary people worry about the end of the month. Right, that unless we answer people's material conditions, the right will use them to continue to block, and the fossil fuel industry will make that argument that we're the only answer to energy poverty, that without us, these people want to lock you into poverty. No, we want to liberate people. We want to be able to provide energy poverty, which means we don't want to just talk about decentralized energy systems in terms of distribution or even generation, but extraction. That's why we say energy has to be a public good. It has to be controlled by people, for people, and distributed. And we have to talk about how much energy we need and what for. And of course, we know our current economy is hugely wasteful. So, but we say we need to reduce our resources. That's absolutely key. But I want to also say there is hope, right? Absolute hope. You look at what happened in Chile, where movements came together, first around a call of, this is not about 30 pesos, about a subway train and a strike, but about 30 years of neoliberalism, and said, we want to imagine a post-extractive future. You look at Colombia, where again, movements came together with a vision about climate and inequality, and have elected a radical government that said, okay, how do we have a justice transition? How do we tackle climate and tackle inequality at the same time? This is happening all over the world. People are genuinely thinking of alternative. The Eco-Social Pact, the Eco-Feminist Green New Deal, the tapestry of alternatives, the justice transition networks. We have to weave those together in a much more compelling story. So we have an alternative against those corporate lobbies who say there is nothing but them. And that's what neoliberalism has done. Its greatest victory has not been the damage and devastation to the world. It's been what it's done to us, that it's told us we can't imagine an alternative, that there was nothing before it, there's nothing now, and there's nothing after it. There is always something after it. And we've transformed the world before, and we can transform the world again. And that means giving people hope, but it recognizes fights we need to have and combining our forces to take. And that, I think, is about the movement approaches, which we're seeing in Africa beginning, we're seeing around the world, where people recognize there are some fights, if we fight, transform the space and our imaginations and our possibilities. So I can't perfectly describe what the world will be that we want to we'll fight for, but I can say what the key fights are going to be, that we have to guarantee people a living wage, social protection, universal public services. We have to guarantee people the right to energy and food. We have to guarantee people the right to housing. And we've done it before. If you look at revolutionary moments throughout history in the last 100 years, what were they built on? They were built on the demands of house, bread, peace, land. Roti kapra makan. The Bolsheviks talked about bread, land, and peace. The Islamists talk about bread and justice. We know that these are the concepts that are really, really important. And behind that, we have to have a transformative agenda. And we have that. We just have to build our power around it.
Thank you, Asad, and thank you to all of our panelists. I think we've laid out tonight the case around the fossil fuel system being a representative system of our overarching structural drivers of inequality and of oppression against marginalized people in the South, a colonial system against indigenous peoples, and one that extracts not only coal, oil, and gas from the land, but extracts the wealth from the peoples who sit and traditionally own that land, and that profit that is made stays in the private hands of a few, and the energy that it's supposed to deliver does not reach almost 2 billion people on this earth. The fossil fuel system has failed massively on its own terms, in terms of delivering energy and in terms of delivering wealth or prosperity to the communities that live at the sites of extraction. And then on top of that, it is the driver of the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the plastics crisis. And that is why so many different people, movements, organizations, cities, and countries have been calling for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to address that industry head on and to build solutions based on justice as a part of the broader movement of movements that Asad spoke about in his meeting. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. If you would like any further information are in the room, there are materials here. You can also, if you're following online, at the fossilfueltreaty.org. And we look forward to speaking with you again, campaigning with you, and transforming our world together. Thank you.
Thank you. And can I remind you, People's Plenary tomorrow, Plenary Room Ramses, 11 o'clock. 10:30 tomorrow, yep. 10:30 tomorrow in the Ramses Plenary, a People's Plenary from all of the constituencies, Indigenous, youth, women and gender, environmental justice, trade unions. Let's put forward our demands, what we want to see happening as a people's COP, not as a polluters COP.
10:30 Ramses.